So if you could describe, just who you are, where you come from briefly, I want you to start off with that.
Okay. I grew up on the Gulf Coast, Gautier, Mississippi, attended Pascagoula High School. Left home to go to the Naval Academy, got my commission 4 years later, served as an intelligence officer. Last day of active/reserve service was this year. Rotated over to the civilian side, worked at the Department of Homeland Security, and then also the Department of State. Intel for the former, and then resource management for the latter. Once I finished that, I went back to grad school, focused on education policy at Vanderbilt, and looked specifically at education issues related to Mississippi. Okay.
What degree did you attain at Vanderbilt?
Education, Master's of Public Policy there. Education focused, in undergrad was BS in Mechanical Engineering.
Okay. Okay. So why run for a U.S. Senate seat?
So I was, part of my responsibility in some of those other agencies over the course of my career was looking at the long term, either the health of the organization and its ability to address a specific situation, or looking at a specific issue that we were working functionally as an interagency within the U.S. government. And when you look at the data specifically for Mississippi, there are some things that give me pause for concern. Specifically, we're not, as a state, positioned to compete in the next few years, so 2020, 2025, 2030. And the decisions that need to be taken today, we're not having the conversations that would shape those. Part of the campaign focus is to actually shape those conversations, and part of my service as a senator is to help sustain those things.
So you talked about just some of your experiences in your former positions, and kind of having an ear on the ground of what Mississippi is looking like and what some of those concerns are. If you can, talk about how you plan to make a difference in some of those areas.
Okay, I'll unpack education as one example, and the approach that we use for that would actually be the approach that we'll use for several issues. But looking specifically at the data, there's a national test that's given every 2 years, and it's given in math and reading, and we're able to look at the performance of Mississippi students in 4th and 8th grade. And when we look at that in terms of proficiency for 4th and 8th graders in math, it's 31 and 25 or 22%. And when you look at the numbers in terms of reading, it's 25 and 27%. Those numbers in terms of proficiency are just too low for the state to actually be competitive down the road. So when I have conversations with individuals how we're going to address that, we look at what the data tells us, but then we also have a conversation about what can be done at the federal level, what can be done at the state level, and what can be done at the local level. And I always try to make sure that everyone understands that those things have to be integrated. But to manage expectations, we talk specifically to what we can do. So for an example, at the federal level, we have the ESEA, which was the legislation passed under President Johnson. We've had reauthorizations of that bill with the No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top as the two most recent reauthorizations. And I talk about what that process will look like from a federal perspective and what we need to do from a state perspective to leverage the funding that comes in through that mechanism. And the conversations we have across all of these issues will be just that. Frame the issue in terms of what the data tells us, and then talk specifically about how we can address those issues both from the state and the federal level.
I know a part of being in this race, you also have to look at who's been in office for so long, what they are doing or what they're not doing. Can you talk about maybe what some of the former senators or even the seated senators that are campaigning now for re-election, what are some things that they haven't done that you think needs to be done to see that federal level difference?
So I'll always, when people ask me specifically pros and cons for the other candidates in the race, I always say that I'm going to focus primarily on what we need to accomplish and how my campaign will get there. I don't see, and this is, and I've said this consistently over the course of the campaign, I don't see the type of conversation, the depth that we need in terms of infrastructure, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of poverty, just those 4 issues alone, which sort of feeds into that broader concern. So when I talk to most citizens, they're concerned about whether or not we're going to have jobs and what type of jobs. And we walk them through how those 4 different areas will impact our ability to recruit jobs to the state. And that speaks to that conversation that's presently not taking place. If you've looked at the information in terms of the articles that have been written, in terms of the lack of a debate that we've not had up to this point, and a couple of other things, the issues of substance aren't being discussed. There are questions about who is getting endorsements, how much money people are raising, but those issues don't impact your life, that average citizen life, and we're not having those conversations.
Why don't you think we're having these conversations?
I think it's sometimes easier not to talk about those things, but I think it's difficult to actually have a frank conversation about where we're at, but it's absolutely necessary if you want to move forward. I will say, in some of the conversations that I've had across the state, I frame those discussions two ways, or through two specific questions. One, I ask what's important to you, and then I'll go wherever that conversation leads us, and I'll share with them what data we have, what my plans are in terms of what legislation is presently out there, and what we need to do to build a coalition to move in that direction towards, better preparing us, both the state and the country, to address those issues. The second question I ask is, how optimistic are you that we are going to actually be able to get something accomplished? And I only bring that up to say this. There's a portion of the population that believes that we're not having those conversations, and that's why it's going to be difficult to get there. There's a portion that believes that even if we had those conversations, we may not be able to marshal the resources to get there. And then there's some that believe that even if we had the conversation and we were able to marshal the resources, that we still would not get there. So trying to address those things while still saying it's important, but we're optimistic based off of the ability to leverage all Mississippians to work towards resolution, whatever that challenge is, it's going to be part of the process. And for every candidate that's in the race, it's almost his or her responsibility to do two things. One, to talk about these issues in a constructive way, but then two, to build trust with the voters, to have them understand that if they trust in the process, if they show up, if they get informed, and they make sure that voice is heard, that will be integrated in the policy process. And then on the back end, we can actually build those conversations, because we're having conversations around fact. And if you do that, some of those divides that we see presently will fade, because we're collectively addressing it as one people.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that part of your campaign, One Mississippi.
Yes.
So if you can, just remind me, what are the top three focuses of your campaign? Why are those your top three focuses?
So domestically, and there is an international piece that gives me pause to concern, but we can get into that a little bit later. But domestically, looking at education, infrastructure, healthcare, and specifically for Mississippi also, just because our rate is so high, the highest in the nation, poverty. But those, at the end of the day, get us to addressing the concerns of jobs. And at the end of the day, I think that's what's most pressing on people, because that impacts the brain drain that we see, and that impacts our ability to recruit businesses down to the state. Those are the four areas.
Is there any, how old are you?
40, I get asked that question quite a bit. 41.
Okay. Yeah, you look, I mean, not that 41 isn't young, but you're probably the youngest, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So does that give you any concern, or, just in terms of the amount of years that you've been in politics? What is your political experience?
So no political experience prior to this. The bulk of my career, the entirety of my career has been focused on government service, either in uniform or outside uniform.
Mm-hmm. Does it concern you at all, that or your age, and any of those things concern you?
I'll take both of those questions separately. The first one, in terms of age, 2 decades of experience within the government. So I'm not young in terms of experience and exposure to a broad range of topics. I think that I've actually had enough experience to see from the 3 different agencies that I've worked in, or departments. Government is about 2 things. One, taking a look at a problem, truly understanding what that problem is. And then the second thing is allocating the scarce resources that we've combined as a society to address those problems. So one is about getting to the truth, and the other one is about just the business of government. How do you go about addressing those? And I didn't get into it within each of the descriptions from my background, but I've worked that across each of those areas in each of those organizations, looking at getting to the truth, primary responsibility of intel regardless of what you do. And then I work the resource management piece both at the State Department and also at the Department of Homeland Security. And it's, again, if you come in with a critical eye towards making sure you have quality data, you have a consensus about where you want to go, and you have a true conversation about what it takes to get there and the consequences of inaction. So in that regards, I think I have a fair amount of experience to actually work through what those challenges are at the U.S. Senate level. And then in terms of age, I actually think I've got enough experience to understand how difficult things are, but still optimistic that we can work towards where we need to be.
Absolutely. Was there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important to add?
I will say the one thing, so the focus of our campaign is, the vision, if you will, is a one Mississippi. And there's essentially two components to that. There's a focus on the people, and then there's a focus on the forward-looking perspective. For the people, we talk about Mississippi is at its best when it's able to leverage the strengths, talents, and participation of all Mississippians. And I call that the 3 Million Strong campaign. 3 million strong, 3 million deep. Roughly the population of our state. And if we're going to get to where we need to be able to tap into the potential of all of our citizens and make sure that they feel like they have a voice within this process, which is really important. And then the second part is that forward-looking perspective. We talk about the one focus, and it essentially says that the investments that we make today, and you truly do have to characterize them as investments, they create the opportunities of tomorrow. Our peer states approach those issues, the ones that are doing well, they approach those issues with that focus towards the long term. And our competitors across the globe, they're also, if they're positioning themselves for the future, they're doing that with the key investments in education, key investments in healthcare, and key investments in infrastructure. And we have to talk about that too as a state.